I'm Shannon Moore, and this is Formation. Over the next few weeks here on the podcast, we are visiting with some local leaders and leaders from beyond our community to talk about the Love Your Neighbor initiative that is going on here at UCC. I hope that you will join us for these very special episodes. Welcome to Formation, a weekly podcast from University Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas, where each week I sit down with people from not only this congregation, but out in the community and talk about faith development and what it means to be a Christian in today's world. And so I'm very thrilled. Katie, you are our first non-UCC guest on the podcast.
Right.
So this is Reverend Katie Meek.
That's right.
A United Methodist ordained minister.
Mm-hmm.
We've known each other, 15 years?
More than that.
More than
16,
that.
17, 18 years, something like
Okay.
that. Yeah.
So, very good friends. You left me for a while.
I did.
We'll talk about that later, but now you're back.
Yeah.
And Katie and Shannon are back.
Back together.
Back together where we belong. Will you tell us a little bit, Katie, about your childhood faith, how your faith was nurtured when you were growing up?
Yeah, okay. So both of my parents didn't really grow up religious and became religious later. Well, I think in their 20s. Campus Crusade for Christ was really big for my dad. And he ended up going to seminary, and that's actually where they met. And so he's sort of like all but ordained.
Okay.
And was one of those, like, our family was like, anytime the doors were open, we were there.
At a
kind of
Methodist
family.
church? United Methodist Church?
It started out Presbyterian. I was baptized Presbyterian, then became United Methodist. Not too long after.
Okay.
I'm like, all of my memories are in the UMC.
Gotcha.
So we were just sort of always there, you know, and they were a young couple in the church and all of that. Sorry, I have something in my eye. So my mom died when I was 4. And I like to say that I didn't have one mother, I had 100, because the church women just really stepped up and became so much for us during that season when my dad was not married, widowered, all of that. So that was my first kind of real experience, was that the church was a place of healing. And that has been I don't think everybody has this experience, and it sort of grieves me that not everybody has that experience, because it was so important to me that the church surrounded us and became sort of family when we were kind of reeling, right?
Well, and we hear so many stories of people who have been harmed by the church. It is refreshing to hear a story where the church was a source of healing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience pretty much my whole life. If I'm in the middle of something, if I can find a church community, I will find healing there. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I feel very blessed to have experienced kind of the best that church is and ought to be for people who are hurting. So,
do you think that had something to do with your call to be a minister, or what was your call experience?
I mean, I think so. It's a little bit of mix of both, right? Like, I don't want to say that I'm called because the church was nice to me.
Well, it was more than nice. I
Right,
mean, it was,
yeah, for sure. And I think that's certainly, I've always felt at home in the church. I've always felt like this is a place where I can come and belong. But I think, and also during that time when it felt like nobody else understood what it felt like to be a kid who'd lost their mom, I felt, because of the church's, my experience in the church, I felt like God did understand. And I felt God's presence really strongly as a young person. And that God was like rooting for me, you know, a little bit. And so I think that probably is the first movement toward some kind of call. And then I sing, and so then I wanted to be a Christian singer, so that was probably the first call.
Amy Grant, kind of?
Stephen Curtis Chapman.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I went to So in the 90s, you know
Okay,
the
don't be
90s.
bragging now.
Right? No. Some of my like young youth formation was like For Him and Point of Grace. Do you remember those?
Uh-huh.
I mean, nowadays, I'm not going to go and listen to them. But back in the day, I was like, oh, I'm going to do that. And then after a while, it became like I was going to be Stephen Curtis Chapman. And Stephen Curtis Chapman always talked about how he talks too much. Like that was people's critique of him live. And so then I was like, well, I'm going to be like him because I'm going to give a message, right, with my music. And then after a while, it just sort of became about the message. And the music got sort of, I mean, it's something that's still close to my heart, but
Right.
I don't necessarily see it as part of the ministry.
My favorite memory from that time period of those contemporary artists was I worked with a woman and she said, "What's the name of that Christian group? Clay pots." I was like, "Jars of clay."
Clay pots, whatever.
Clay
It's the
pots,
same
jars
thing.
of clay. So when did you become ordained? You went to seminary.
Yeah, I went to seminary. In the UMC, it takes a really long time. So I think it was like a 7-year journey. I started, but I've never had a job that wasn't ministry except like part time. You know, I worked at Eddie Bauer. But otherwise, I've been in ministry since I was 20.
Okay.
And yeah, only 1 year
Wow,
in my
10
life.
years.
Yeah, just 10. No, that's 20 something years now, 22.
Mm-hmm.
So, so yeah, I've just sort of always done it. I did youth ministry, and then from there it sort of grew. I thought I never wanted to preach, never wanted to be a preacher, never wanted to be sole pastor, and then doggone it, the bishop made me sole pastor of a church. And soon, it was my first gig in Weatherford. And then, so that was sort of how you and I.
Right, because I was serving a church in Weatherford as a choir director, associate minister.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we were very nearby.
We'd go have lunch together.
Right.
Downtown.
And I remember some of those early struggles that you had especially in the United Methodist Church, at some of those small churches, they're accustomed to getting a new pastor every year or two.
Yeah.
And they kept you there
4 years.
A while.
4 years. And the truth is, I like, well, they were so good to me. They really sort of raised me up. I mean, the first year and a half of preaching, I was like, I do not like this. Every week, supposed to say something. You know, like
the whole first year and a half.
Yeah, it was about 18 months before and then I started to listen to other preachers, and then I just got better and better. Like I could feel that my performance wasn't. But then once I actually started enjoying it, feeling like I was not bad, now it's like my favorite thing. Like it took me a really long time to discern that call. But I love to preach. Preaching and teaching are the two for me.
What does sermon preparation look like for you?
Well, I would like to say that I started on Tuesday and then finish it on Thursday, but this is what happens.
We're keeping it real.
Yeah, we're going to keep it real. I sort of read the scripture a few days out, generally 4 or 5 days out, something like that. And then honestly, I really do like just sit on it. I let the Spirit work with my spirit for a while. And by a while, I mean until about Saturday afternoon, if I'm preaching on Sunday. And then I sit down, and generally generally by the time I've sat down, I have an idea of where it's going to go, and then I just plunk it out.
Well, that does leave some space for the Spirit to work, and I think that's really important, because I think a lot of times preachers get a little too self-important about that work.
Yeah.
And when we give the Spirit time to work with our spirit, I love how you phrase that.
Yeah.
Then that's a great collaboration.
Yeah.
So.
And also for me, I like the immediacy of I just finished this. This is on my heart. This is the thing that I'm supposed to say. Versus if I finish it on Wednesday or Thursday, I gotta make sure I'm still convicted about it by Sunday, and all of that. Like I'm all over the place a lot of times. So it's helpful just to be like, no, this is the moment.
I think one of the best sermons I ever preached was my senior minister at my previous church got sick on Saturday night, like 9:00.
Yeah.
And called and said, "You're going to preach tomorrow."
Right.
And I went to bed. And I got up Sunday morning, looked at the text, and I just talked about it.
Wow.
And it was great. Now I haven't had the courage to do that again.
Yeah.
But The Spirit will work.
Absolutely.
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 And you mentioned teaching, and that's something I really want to talk about in the next segment.
Okay.
And we're going to do that after we take a short break. We will be right back to continue this conversation with Reverend Katie Meek.
Hi, I'm Russ Peterman, Senior Minister of University Christian Church Disciples of Christ here in Fort Worth. And I don't know about you, but one of the things that keeps me up at night is the division that I see in our nation. And as this 2024 election cycle heats up, communities and neighborhoods are going to become even more divided, less kind, more polarized than we already are, maybe more than we've ever been. But at UCC, we believe that Jesus offers a better way of engaging one another. He calls us to love our neighbors and to actively embody kindness. You see, we believe that as a church, we need to be active in bringing our community together. And so we're going to do just that with a church-wide grassroots campaign that we are calling Love Your Neighbor. And this neighborhood movement will focus on actively modeling kindness, working towards inclusive community, and doing all that we can to undo polarization. So I hope you'll join us in this movement, because in a time filled with negativity, we all have a choice to make. We can choose to love our neighbors. And if we do that, we will have accomplished more than just making it through an election. You see, we have the power and the courage to make our neighborhoods, our community, our nation, look even more like the kingdom of God.
Well, we're back with Reverend Katie Meek, United Methodist minister, but not just a minister, also a missionary.
A missionary.
Tell me about that. How long did that sit on your heart before you followed that call?
A while. So, okay, this is one of my favorite stories about my own call story.
Okay.
I knew early on that I wanted to get ordained. I also knew I wanted to become a missionary because my faith was very much formed in mission. I'd been to Kenya twice once by the time I started ministry, by 19, I guess, and then again later. But, and I sort of had to discern whether or not to get ordained first or become a missionary first, and decided to get ordained, mostly because I was chicken. I didn't want to go by myself overseas and live there in my 20s. And then I went to school, and I really liked school. I went to Bright, and I also felt called to get a PhD and teach. And after a while, it was like, okay, you can't have 15 calls. Let's not be greedy. Right?
I'm preaching, I'm
Right,
singing,
right,
I'm
exactly,
PhD,
like so many.
visionary.
Those are ridiculous. So I sort of gave up. I figured I'd get a doctorate, but gave up on teaching, right? And then I got ordained and served some churches and got my dream job at a church. And I remember sitting in the office that first year at that dream job and thinking, this is not all of it. Like, this is wonderful, but there's something else. And so my sister always says that you wait until God sits on your chest so you can't breathe, and then you do the thing. And so that's sort of what happened to me. Like, I didn't think that I thought missionary service would be like a late in life kind of thing. By the time I got there, I didn't want to go by myself. I thought, well, maybe someday I'll get married and we'll go together. And then I just couldn't ignore it anymore. So applied, became a missionary. My job description had nothing to do with university teaching, absolutely nothing. And then I showed up in Sierra Leone, and they had just started a university 2 months before I got there. And the bishop said, no, you'll be teaching. So nobody knew. Like, it was the Lord who orchestrated that. Like, I didn't know when I became a missionary that it was also an answer to that third call of teaching at the university level.
Is Sierra Leone, were you happy with that placement? Is that
Yeah.
where you wanted to go?
So no, I wanted to go to Latin America because I speak some Spanish, and I'm a little vain, and I want my Spanish to be great. But instead, they put me in West Africa, and they said, well, I interviewed for a job in Tanzania, and then they called me back 10 minutes later after the interview and was like, hey, we think you're a better fit for Sierra Leone. And I said, where is Sierra Leone?
Mm-hmm.
And they gave me the weekend to think about it. And then that was a Friday. And on Monday, I said yes after a bunch of research. And I showed up there sight unseen. But the longer I was there, the more it was like, this is the exact right fit.
Especially since you're getting to teach too. Was there any, what's the word I'm looking for? Resistance to a woman teaching
Nope.
men or anything?
No, it is a pretty patriarchal society, and so every once in a while they would say things that I'd be like, watch what you're saying. Let's think about this for a minute. But and I did have to teach a class about women in ministry, and the students that I was teaching how to preach were like, no, women shouldn't be preaching. And then I'd be like, come on, y'all. And then most of the time by the end of that class they would be like, oh, wait a second, I've rethought, but for the most part, they're very respectful. It's like women are so strong in that society and in that culture. And so a lot of times in word it was patriarchal, but in deed it was sort of something different.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, Katie, I want to spend the last bit of our time together. I think many folks who listen to the podcast probably know that our church is launching a campaign this fall during election season called Love Your Neighbor. And the idea is that there's so much division in our neighborhoods, in our country, even in our, some of our churches, about politics and about, just how to be in the world. We're trying to really latch onto these words of Jesus, who says that after loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and spirit, the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor. Can you talk to me a little bit about what love your neighbor means to you, and the difference in how people treat each other here versus what you saw in Sierra Leone?
Yeah, Sierra Leoneans are known for, well, let me say this first. I think that the thing that I have learned is that love is about hospitality, it's about welcome, and it's about understanding and accommodating. Especially accommodating differences, right?
Okay.
Because when we talk about neighbor, we're talking about somebody else, like the other, right? So there's always going to be some kind of difference. And Sierra Leoneans are very good at hospitality. I mean, like, they're known in the region for hospitality. And so sort of what I learned there is how to be accommodating of the differences and how to sort of go out of your way to make people feel welcome. And this isn't from Sierra Leone, but I have a girlfriend who I met in Sierra Leone, and she's white and her husband's black. And she always talks about hospitality when it comes to being married to a black man of sort of a different United States culture. And she talks about how hospitality for her is about making sure that the condiments in her fridge are welcoming not only of white folks, but also of black folks, right? That, like, it goes down to even like the art on your walls, making sure that when they come into your home, they feel like you have prepared a place for them, right? And I just think that's very profound, because then I look around at my house and I'm like, oh, I've got white mayonnaise in my fridge,
And a poster of Stephen Curtis Chapman.
Right.
So, when you got there, I remember I was wondering if you'll share this story with everybody about the beverages.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So in the United States, if somebody comes over to your house, you say, "What can I get?" Well, would you like something to drink? Most of the time, even "What can I get you?" is a different posture. Would you like something to drink? But in Sierra Leone, if you ask somebody if they want something to drink, you're politely saying, "I don't want to serve you anything," right?
How long did it take you to figure that out?
I mean, I think it was my 4th year there that I realized that I was basically insulting people when they came over to my home, because I'd be like, what can I get? Or would you like something to drink? Would you like some tea? Would you like some water? And there, the rule is you say no, right? If somebody asks you, you're sort of like, no, I don't, because they're just being polite. Maybe they can't afford what they have to give, so whatever.
Almost like, I hope you don't want any water.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Exactly. And I had no idea. My students taught me that in a class where we talked about differences in culture. What they do is they just bring it out, right? And most of the time they'll bring it out in a tray. All the different options. Because if you ask them specifically, they'll just say, well, whatever you have. But if you actually really want to be welcoming of them, you come out with Fanta and Vimto and Diet Coke and Coke and all the different things, and you come and present it to them, and they choose for themselves, right? And the assumption there is that see, from an American standpoint, I'm like, I'm gonna force you to take this, but they see it differently. There's just a sense that you're in my home, and what is mine is yours, and not just a little bit, but abundantly, right? But abundantly. Like, I have prepared a place for you.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Right?
How can we, in our context, take that biblical principle and maybe apply some of the things that you learned from Sierra Leone, or just other ideas that you have? How can we be neighbor to each other, especially during this difficult time?
Well, I do think it requires intentionality. I remember in seminary, we talked a lot about finances and money and all of this, and I'm like, why are we talking so much about money? And it does feel, but I realized after a while that Jesus talks more about money than he does about prayer, right? And so oftentimes what happens is our finances separate us. The difference in class and experience and all of that is very separating. And I remember thinking, I don't actually know any poor people, right? Like, I don't actually know the people who might be considered my neighbors, right? And so I think it requires intentionality. And every time I move, I get more and more insulated into my own little corner, and then a year later, I'm like, wait a second, here I am with everybody who's just like me. So then having to intentionally widen the circle. And I mean, on a practical level, that looks like a lot of different things. Some of it looks like reaching out and going places where you wouldn't normally go, and some of it looks like reaching out and opening your places to people who wouldn't normally come here, right? So it looks like accommodating that difference. Like, when you ask them to come here, make sure that you're okay, that whatever it is they do is different is okay, right? That you're cool with it and you can accommodate it, and the opposite as well. I mean, there were so many times in Sierra Leone that people were just like, I would make so many mistakes, and they'd be like, well, you're a missionary. They were just so gracious. Like, all of the social mistakes, I would say rude things, not realizing it, all of those sorts of things, and they would just accommodate me. Well, you're a missionary,
It's
and
to
love
be
me through it.
expected.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, that's great. And I love that idea about intentionality, because you can't love your neighbor if you don't want to.
Right.
It's something that you have to decide to do.
Yeah.
And then do it.
Right.
Well,
Which is the part that's uncomfortable.
that's the hard part, but I think that's what we got to do. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time already.
I know.
But always a pleasure to talk to you, and maybe you can come back again sometime.
For sure, I'd love to.
We can talk about 90s Christian.
Jesus freak, man. We'll talk about it.
All right, we'll do it. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast today. If you'd like to share your story, I hope you'll let me know. Shoot me an email to formation@uccftw.com. Take care. Have a great week.